Thank you very much. And I just want to say it's one of the real delights about this conference for me is, as a law professor, and I think that you all will, fellow lawyers will commiserate, is just I love the look on a law professor's face when they are listening to a scientist and learn something that's actual knowledge about the world, because it's just this wonderful wow, that's so cool. Right? We don't get that in our profession too much, reading cases. So this is going to be a great panel to start the day with. I'm going to have a prolonged moderator's framing of the issue, just to tell you about one of the rules that I know, one of the rules that we'll be discussing. But before I get to my prolonged moderator's intro, I want to introduce the rest of my panel. To my right is Joanne, and in the order I think in which they're going to speak, not necessarily. But Joanne Spalding is the director of litigation for the Sierra Club. She oversees all of the Sierra Club's environmental and climate-related litigation. Susan Glickman is the vice president of policy and partnerships at CLEO Institute and was with us yesterday, you saw on stage, for the debate. Steve Bradbury is a former general counsel of the Department of Transportation, and I think for a little over a week, a former acting secretary of transportation. And my colleague at Heritage Foundation, and Michael Buschbacher, my former colleague in the administration, who was senior counsel in ENRD, senior counsel in the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the Department of Justice, where he oversaw the 600 really fantastic lawyers in that division of the Justice Department.
Just helped others oversee.
Helped others oversee, and is now a partner at Boyden Gray and Associates in Washington, D.C. So thank you all for joining, and I look forward to everyone's expertise on this stuff. We were talking, so we're talking today about two rules that EPA proposed in, I think, April and May of last year. That one of the rules would mandate that all 2/3 of all cars sold in the United States be electric vehicles by the year 2032. And the other one is a very ambitious proposal to require all new and modified natural gas plants and all new and modified combined cycle natural gas plants, I should say. That's a very important distinction. And existing coal plants to adopt the advanced carbon reduction technologies such as carbon capture and storage or green hydrogen to achieve the emissions rate that we could achieve if we adopted those technologies. And we are facing what's called what we lawyers call the CRA look-back window. It's the Congressional Review Act. It creates an expedited procedure for a new Congress in 2025 to vacate a rule that was enacted in the last 6 months, last 30 days, 90 days of legislative days, effectively the last 6 months of the previous administration. And so when an administration is facing the end of its 4-year term, there's a flurry of activity in the April, May timeframe to get rules finalized before the CRA look-back window. So all that to say that we're expecting these rules to be finalized in the next month or 2 months. I'll just say that these rules, which don't mention each other, even though they mention other proposed rules, there are significant concerns that if these rules, on the part of critics, significant concerns that if these rules are implemented together, it could just wreck the electricity grid, because the vehicle rule, which will require 2/3 of vehicle sold to be electric vehicles, will add significantly to the demand on the electricity grid at the same time as the power plant rule could severely constrict the ability of the electricity grid to expand. And that could create a scarcity situation in electricity, sort of like a regulatory reenactment of what's happened in Europe. And so I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about what I kind of sort of know more about, which is the power plant rule. and what I think are going to be the challenges there. And then, and I'll just start this by saying that at the beginning of 2021, Michael Regan, the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, gave an interview to Politico Pro in which he said, in response to, what is the administration going to do if West Virginia versus EPA goes against you, which it ultimately did. And his answer was, we're facing a very different judiciary now than we were facing when the Clean Power Plan was proposed in 2015, because Trump appointed 230 judges to the bench. So it's a much more, so now the range of the possible may be much more constricted than what it was before. I mention this because I am willing to bet a lot of money that it will emerge in the next couple of years that Michael Regan did not think that these rules would survive court review, and that he, or at least doesn't like his chances that these rules will survive court review. I think Joanne is probably likes those chances better. But I will tell you what I think are a couple of the main vulnerabilities of this rule. And it's that Section 111, the way that Section 111 of the Clean Air Act works is that it says that the administrator of EPA shall determine the best systems of emissions reduction for new source performance standards. And the best systems of emissions reduction, so it has to determine a emissions rate based on the best systems of emissions reduction that has been adequately demonstrated, right? That's what the statute says. And so what that means is that EPA goes out and finds, what it typically means is that EPA goes out, looks at the sector that is to be regulated by the rule, and it sees who has the lowest emissions rate and what technology they are using to achieve that lowest emissions rate of whatever pollutant it is. And then it says, if everybody, this technology allows you to achieve an emissions rate of X grams of whatever it is per unit of electrical output. So we're going to impose this rate as the emissions rate, the new source performance standards for this entire sector, and assuming that companies can come up with some other scheme if they want to, but at least if they adopt this adequately demonstrated technology, they can achieve the emissions rate. Okay. So the question becomes, and EPA is at great pains in its preamble to the power plant rule to explicate this, and I think there's a certain amount of smoke and mirrors involved. EPA has to demonstrate that these technologies have been adequately demonstrated. What does that mean? Well, we know what it means from the DC Circuit cases that EPA cites in its preamble. And if you read those cases carefully, you see that the DC Circuit distinguishes sharply between technologies that have been adequately demonstrated and new technologies that are imposed by EPA on industry through a technology forcing provision of the Clean Air Act. And the technology forcing provisions of the Clean Air Act do not include Section 111. The DC Circuit has been very clear about that. And so there's a distinction between stuff that's adequately demonstrated and new technologies that can be adopted through a technology forcing provision. And when you see the cases on adequate demonstration, what you see is that in every case, the technology in question, a scrubber on a smokestack or whatever, has been adopted by somebody in the sector to be regulated and is being operated at scale economically for the purpose for which EPA is expecting the sector to adopt that technology. If you look at the examples that EPA is giving for adequate to substantiate the claim of adequate demonstration for both carbon capture and storage and green hydrogen, and by the way, so the green hydrogen refers to hydrogen produced by zero emissions means, and that's an important distinction because it takes more energy to produce hydrogen than you get out of it when you burn it in a power plant. So if you're producing hydrogen through fossil means, through a natural gas plant to produce the hydrogen, that's a net increase in carbon emissions compared to just burning natural gas. So these two technologies, all of the examples that it gives for carbon capture and storage are in the food processing industry. There's one plant that it talks about in Ireland that's planned. It's not even under construction yet, or it might be under construction, but it was planned when EPA was considering this. In none of the examples that EPA cites for adequate demonstration of carbon capture and storage are power sector examples that are at scale for the purpose that you would be implementing it. And there's another problem in all of this for EPA, which is that it has a similar vulnerability to the Clean Power Plan that was vacated in West Virginia versus EPA, in that it requires a bunch of stuff to happen outside the fence line of the regulated entity. That is, things that the regulated entity has no control over, right? A build out in this case of an entire infrastructure for carbon capture, storage, and sequestration that none of the regulated industries have any way of doing. It's not their comparative advantages. They aren't the ones who would build it, and the people who would build it are not subject to regulation under the Clean Air Act. And not only are they not subject to regulation under the Clean Air Act, none of this is an area of EPA's expertise. And so even if Chevron goes away or Chevron is modified, and Chevron deference for the non-lawyers is that courts defer to the agency's legal interpretations of law, that will be a real setback for the administrative state's ability to generate legal authority from its statutory authorities. But courts presumably would, even if they curtail Chevron, they would presumably continue to defer to agencies on areas within the agency's technical expertise. And it is very easy to demonstrate that the build-out of a carbon capture and pipeline storage is not within the agency's expertise. It's not within the agency's jurisdiction, and you read page after page after page in the preamble of EPA's forecasts of how much it would cost and how long it would take to build out this entire infrastructure, and you have to say to yourself, EPA does not know what it's talking about. This is not an area of EPA's expertise. The DC Circuit is not going to defer to EPA's technical judgment on any of this, right? And so, or at least there's a possibility that it won't. And so that is another serious vulnerability of this rule, and it has other implications as well. As far as green hydrogen is concerned, I'll just say on the carbon capture and storage side that at least somebody is doing carbon capture and storage somewhere in the world for some purpose. It may not be enough to substantiate adequate demonstration, but there are examples of carbon capture and storage. There are literally zero examples of large-scale production of green hydrogen through renewable or nuclear power. And so that is going to be, and these technologies were found to be not adequately demonstrated and rejected for that reason in the original Clean Power Plan from just 2015. So to be able to substantiate the change the change in the agency's position between 2015 and 2023 on this issue is going to be a really uphill climb. So these are all the problems that I think are vulnerabilities of the power plant rule, and it will be very interesting to see. There were significant comments filed in the docket for that rule that pointed out that the very cases that EPA is citing to in order to establish the law, to explicate the law on adequate demonstration in the DC Circuit are all going to go against it, or could all very easily go against it. So I'll just say that's where one final word on this before and finally bring my long preamble to a close, is that that EPA, another thing EPA doesn't know, has no way of forecasting is what industry will actually do in response to this rule. It's saying, oh, it's going to be by 2035, everybody, all these companies are not combined cycle natural gas plants. The largest natural gas plants are going to be able to adopt carbon capture and storage. There's going to be a complete infrastructure for this stuff, and it's all going to be built out. There is a much more likely scenario that EPA did not, in my opinion, did not adequately consider. I mean, it just not in a legal sense, but in just I would like to have seen more consideration of it, which is that the rule. This is a very, very important thing to understand about this rule, is that it applies to combined cycle natural gas plants, but not other kind, not simple cycle combustion turbine natural gas plants. And the reason for that is, this is very paradoxical because in terms of carbon emissions, the lowest carbon emissions in the whole entire world of baseload electrical generation, there are only two sources that have lower carbon emissions per unit of output than a combined cycle natural gas plant, and it's hydropower and nuclear. And so when if you're looking at, of all the fossil fuel power plants, the ones with the lowest carbon emissions per unit, by far the lowest, just a third of the carbon emissions of a coal plant, are these large combined cycle. Combined cycle means that there's a combustion cycle, and then a secondary cycle that's a steam boiler that the exhaust from the simple cycle heats up and then generates another power output on the basis of the steam generating unit. Okay. So what these power plants are more likely to do is to look at this and say, well, if we're only subject to regulation as a combined cycle plant, then all we have to do to escape having to adopt carbon capture and storage is just shut down the steam cycle and operate as a simple cycle plant. And there's another reason why they would do this, which is in jurisdictions like California and elsewhere, where there's large amounts of intermittent solar and wind are being put on the grid, the only way that a grid can be stabilized after you have put like 30% solar and wind power on it is by, right now, until we have like large deployment of battery power, is through intermediate and peaker natural gas plants, which are simple cycle combustion, because you can ramp them up and down quickly. Unlike the steam cycle plants the combined cycle plants take a long time to ramp up and down. And so those plants, which are much more carbon intensive, much higher carbon emissions than a combined cycle plant, are the ones that the rule is likely going to push the utilities to adopt. And so the rule is just full of problems. Anyway, hopefully Joanne has is more upbeat about the rule. So. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for that. I want to say that to start off, I agree with you that a problem with the rule is that it leaves out regulation of simple cycle plants, because I agree with you that what will happen, the combined cycle plants might just turn themselves into simple cycle plants, but at a minimum, they will reduce their generation, and generation will shift to the simple cycle plants. Mm-hmm. And that's bad for the climate, and it's more polluting, et cetera. But I think the solution is just that EPA needs to adopt a rule that actually regulates all the plants, not necessarily through carbon capture and sequestration. But I want to back up and just talk a little bit about how we got here. And yeah, I do. I have a lot of disagreement with the legal defensibility of the rule, et cetera. But I feel like it's a little bit of a setting the stage what might be helpful, because I don't know how familiar everybody is with these rules, but it might be good to have a little bit of the history. So Sierra Club's been advocating for greenhouse gas emissions standards from fossil fuel-fired power plants for like 20 years now, actually over 2 decades. And the reason is that power plants are the largest stationary source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And according to conservative estimates, they're responsible for over $300 billion a year of monetized climate damages. That's every single year. So we really need to get deep reductions. We need to get immediate reductions. The Clean Air Act provides a mechanism for doing that. It's not just a mechanism for doing that. It is a congressional mandate to reduce dangerous air pollution from stationary sources, which are these large emitters of various pollutants. And that applies to conventional pollutants like NOx and sulfur dioxide and mercury, and it also applies to greenhouse gases, as the Supreme Court ruled in Massachusetts versus EPA in 2007. So the section that applies to power plants is 111. This is the stationary source section, so that's what we're talking about here. 111B applies to new and modified sources. 111D applies to existing sources. And the way that it works is that EPA sets the standard for new and modified sources, and then they set these. They adopt a best system of emissions reduction for existing sources. States then take that and develop a plan and apply it to each source within their state. If states fail to do that through a state implementation plan, then EPA steps in and does a federal implementation plan. So this is the cooperative federalism approach of the Clean Air Act. And the state plans have to be no less stringent than what EPA adopts in its best system of emissions reduction. So what happened is the EPA adopted a plan under Section 111, the Clean Power Plan, that the Supreme Court threw out. And they did it because EPA tried to create a rule that would reflect what the industry was actually going to do, what utilities really wanted, which was to say, we don't want to invest in these old fossil fuel-fired plants. Some of them have been online since we're retiring them, but since the 50s and 60s and 70s. They're very old, they're outdated. We don't want to continue our investments into that. We want to build renewable energy, and so don't make us retrofit these plants, and because what we're going to do is generation shifting. We're going to shift from the highest polluting plants to the lower polluting plants. EPA drafted a rule reflecting what the industry wanted to do. The Supreme Court said you can't look outside the fence line. You have to adopt standards based on technology that can be applied at the plant. So that's what this current proposal does. And the technologies that can be applied at the plant are limited for carbon dioxide, and they involve operation, like more efficient operations. You can get from coal plants 6 to 10% emission reduction just by operating them at their most efficient level, but that's not enough. And carbon capture and sequestration, hydrogen co-firing. And there's also, you can co-fire gas with coal to reduce coal plant emissions. So where I'm going to disagree with Mario is whether the evidence that EPA has amassed in the record actually demonstrates shows that these are demonstrated or available control technologies. And so the EPA doesn't have to point to, here is an existing plant using this. It just has to say, this has been demonstrated in some form, because the Clean Air Act allows for transfer technology. It doesn't require you to have this exact kind of source using this exact kind of control technology. So let me just refer to my way too copious notes for a moment. So yeah, the proposal applies to existing coal plants, new gas plants, and existing gas plants. There's already, nobody's building new coal plants, so there is already a standard for new coal plants, but nobody's building them, so EPA did not revisit that. So the EPA projects, just to put this in context, that the proposed rule is going to reduce CO2 emissions by 617 million metric tons through 2042, also reducing tens of thousands of tons of conventional pollutants like fine particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, which are smog-forming pollutants. EPA calculates that the rule would provide net monetized climate benefits of around $5.4 to $5.9 billion each year. And for 2030 alone, the rule would save 1,300 lives, would avoid 800. I think some of these numbers are wrong, so I'm not going to read them. But it would reduce approximately 2,000 cases of asthma onset and more than 300,000 cases of asthma symptoms, and would prevent the tens of thousands of missed school days, missed work days. So the standards that EPA is proposing, may seem novel, but they are based in technology that exists, technology that can be applied to these power plants, and technology that will save lives. So, and the other thing is that these are very long time horizons that we're talking about. EPA is able to look, the case law says it can look toward what the agency can project for the regulated future will be available. And so these rules only apply for coal plants, I'm going to start with coal plants, only apply a carbon capture and sequestration standard to plants that are planned to be in existence after 2040. Remember, these are old plants. Even at 2040, the most recent coal plant, I think, was built in around 2009. So it's already going to be 30 years old. So we're talking about a small number of plants that would be required to apply carbon capture and sequestration in the coal arena, because it's like a useful life of a coal plant is about 50 years. By that time, most of them will be way past their useful life. And they can avoid that standard by committing to earlier retirement dates. So in terms of gas plants, it only applies to the very largest of existing gas plants, and it applies to standards to plants that will run the carbon capture standard. The standard based on CCS applies to the plants that will run the most frequently, and plants can avoid this by just reducing their operations to the point where they don't have to apply that because they won't fit into that category anymore. So these are feasible standards. EPA, I agree, it's a question about what kind of deference EPA will get. The actual CCS, carbon capture unit, is totally within EPA's wheelhouse. The system of the infrastructure for storage is not different from other kinds of pollution control that EPA has adopted in the past, where you take the pollutants out of the air, that you end up with coal ash that has these pollutants. Like, what do you do with that? No EPA, EPA doesn't. The companies that are going to be regulating or producing, rather, the pollution control equipment aren't controlled by the utilities, but that's true of any pollution control equipment. So I don't really think that is a problem. I think that it is a question of how much deference EPA will get. I totally agree with that. So we can talk more about the power plant standards, but I do want to spend a little bit of time on the vehicle standards. And I don't really have any idea how much time I have, Mario. So
I think I'm a little worried about that myself, actually, for all of us. But I think, at least 5 more minutes.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. So EPA has regulated vehicle pollution since 1970. It's an incredibly successful program under the Clean Air Act. It's under 202 of the Clean Air Act, enacted under President Nixon. And since that time, vehicle pollution, such as like particulate matter, hydrocarbons, nitrogen oxides, have been dramatically reduced while achieving economic growth, even as vehicle numbers and vehicle miles traveled have increased dramatically. So for example, new vehicles are 98% cleaner than they were in the 1960s. The regulations have spurred technical innovation, and the benefits have far outweighed the cost. For every dollar spent to reduce emissions, it's resulted in $9 of benefits. Greenhouse gas reductions from vehicles are crucial. Transportation contributes 29% of all U.S. greenhouse gases, with motor vehicles being the largest contributor. I want to also point out, California has a special role here. Congress has determined that because California was previously regulating motor vehicles before the federal government was doing so, and because of special problems with California air, it's the Southern California in particular, and inland California has the most polluted air in the country, largely as a result of motor vehicles. So the Clean Air Act carves out an exception for California to be able to regulate motor vehicles under and EPA has to grant a waiver for assuming that those regulations are needed for California to reduce to address its air pollution problems. So there's a test, but I'm not going to go into the test. So currently there's litigation on the standards. So the Biden administration has adopted standards governing model years 2023 to 26. That is currently in litigation, as well as, and has also granted California's request for a waiver. And both of those cases are pending before the DC Circuit, and they've been argued. EPA has adopted a new proposal that covers new proposals that cover light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles for model years 2027 to 2032, which is what you were talking about, right, Mario? And it is expected to finalize those rules this spring. So I'm not going to, so the pending litigation, there are issues in the pending litigation tee up some of the issues that are likely to come up in challenges to the new set of rules that cover 27 to 32. And so some of the issues are related to whether EPA has authority to consider the availability of electric vehicles, whether it, I mean, the current litigation, there's no requirement that car companies build electric vehicles. And by the way, the car companies are on EPA's side in the current in the challenges to the current rule. But the the definition of a motor vehicle includes anything. It includes any vehicle. It doesn't have to be an internal combustion engine vehicle. So it is. EPA can say, oh, there's this other way of reducing pollution from a vehicle, and that is building a car with an electric engine. And so, and it's also obviously the compliance with the current standards is possible through strong hybridization and other technologies that exist for internal combustion engines. The car companies have said they want to produce electric vehicles, so probably that's the direction this will go. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I can answer questions about some of this, but I want to be able to move on. But I do agree that there is an issue with growth in the electric sector with, because of electrification of vehicles. And that is something that and there's also a growth in the electric sector because of
population.
AI, and data processing is huge. And we're finding that coal plants, some coal plants that were intending to retire are now thinking, the utilities are saying, well, we need to keep these online because of all this growth. So we do need to deal with that. There are ways to deal with that. The Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, has supports development of renewables in order that will help with that problem. And but we are looking at electrification that will happen over the course of the next 10 years, and that will give us time to build out that infrastructure. We also need to build more transmission, and that's another. These are really challenging things to do. It's just the issue is, though, like, we either do them or we fry the planet. So that is, it's not enough to say, oh, are we able to, does EPA, I mean, we believe that EPA has ample authority to do what it's doing, and in fact is required to do so by the Clean Air Act. But there's also a moral imperative to get this done, and we just need to make it happen. And so saying, you can nitpick, and who knows what the courts will do. As Mario pointed out, there are a lot of relatively recent appointees to the court that might take a different view, but the bottom line is we need to get this done, and EPA does have the legal authority to do it.
Thank you, John.
I actually thought it'd be fair to go to the other side or whatever and come back this way. No, go ahead.
So if you want to go next, Michael?
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have the right slides?
Can we go? Oh, Lipsia's not here.
All right. Are these the new ones? Sorry, I'm annoying.
Let me
like that.
let me see if I can figure this out.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't think Lipsia's here. Entonces, ¿cómo?
All right. So that's the wrong one. That's my more provocative title that I abandoned. I settled for a slightly less. I did. Lipsia said that she'd get it up, but maybe because of the change in order, not. Why don't we take a different order then?
Can I get a volunteer from one of my students to Julian? There, you're looking a little bored. Can you go, no, just kidding. He's in rapt attention, actually. Can you find Lipsia and tell her that we need the other,
this
this
I
morning's
think
version
works,
of
but
these
it's
slides?
just the
Wrong slides.
wrong slides. I sent other slides to Lipsia more recently. You can read that cool quote from Sing Like a State, which is a great quote.
Do you want to go, Steve? Did you want to change it?
Yes,
order?
Steve's going to talk about the office stuff too, so can we get the right slides set up? And all this?
Great. Okay, thank you. Thanks. So I have a different approach, different view from Joanne's on these rules. For decades now, Congress has gotten in the habit of not really grappling with the biggest issues facing the country and addressing them through legislation, but has relied on regulatory agencies to take on some of these hard issues through statutory grants of authority that in some cases are pretty general or pretty old. And that's been the case with the Clean Air Act. Clean Air Act was enacted in the 1970s and gives the EPA broad authority in these areas we're focusing on now, emissions from transportation, emissions from electricity generation, according to conditions and standards that Congress set forth, with the real focus on conventional pollutants that cause air pollution, smog, harm the air quality in local and regional areas of the country. And Congress has also gotten in the habit of relying on Chevron deference, the doctrine that the courts defer to reasonable interpretations by these regulatory agencies of their statutory authorities. For up till now, that system, which is not really very democratic, because it gives so much authority to unaccountable administrative agencies like EPA, which are not elected and not politically accountable except through the president to the American people. But that system has worked pretty well when it comes to the regulation of these conventional pollutants. As Joanne pointed out, in the case of automobiles, the EPA regulates emissions from the tailpipe of new vehicles. And that conventional regulation has involved the addition of new equipment and features on board the vehicle to reduce, capture, scrub out the conventional pollutants that cause air pollution. And as Joanne pointed out, for new vehicles produced today, they are from 75 to 95 or more % cleaner than older vehicles, previous generations of vehicles, in terms of those pollutants that cause smog, air pollution issues, et cetera. And that's because of things like catalytic converters, new fuel mixtures, fuel injection, and sealing technology on the fueling systems of cars so that unburned hydrocarbons aren't released to the same extent. So it's been a huge success, really. Similarly, with electricity generation, electric generating plants have gotten more efficient. They've gotten cleaner in terms of emission of these traditional pollutants. But this system does not work for addressing climate change. And to focus for a moment on vehicles, automobiles, the issue with climate change is carbon dioxide emission. That is the molecule that the EPA is focusing on. And it simply doesn't work through these 1970s statutory structures. If you look at gas-powered automobiles, it's impossible to have a gas-powered internal combustion engine vehicle that does not emit carbon dioxide. When you burn gasoline, you produce carbon dioxide. Similarly, with electric generating plants, you can't have a natural gas-fired power plant or a coal-fired power plant that doesn't emit carbon dioxide. The technology is simply not there yet. to prevent that from happening. You can reduce it in certain ways, but you can't eliminate it. So the EPA is now trying to use these statutes that were enacted in the 1970s to address air pollution problems with conventional pollutants and apply it to this entirely different set of issues raised by the attempt to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide. And the system doesn't work. And so what you see in these two proposed rulemakings is EPA is forced to go way outside the lines of the traditional application of these statutes and invent entirely new ways, pretty cleverly, pretty creatively, to try to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And so for vehicles, what the EPA is doing is setting the emission limits for carbon dioxide and actually for other conventional pollutants at such stringent levels, so low, such strict levels, that it is not possible for an internal combustion engine gas-powered vehicle to meet those standards. It is simply not possible. But that doesn't mean that every new vehicle will have to be electric and no internal combustion engine gas vehicle can be sold, because EPA does not apply the standards to each and every vehicle on a per vehicle basis. Sort of cleverly, what EPA does is it applies the standards on an average basis across an automaker's entire fleet. So when you apply them on a fleet-wide average basis, then that gives EPA the tool to set the standards and sort of manipulate the standards to particular rates and getting them more stringent over time so that it can achieve a desired percentage of electrification in the automaker's fleet, because the automakers will have no choice but to build and sell electric vehicles which don't emit, while they're operating, carbon dioxide in order to reach these fleet-wide average standards as they are applied. And so EPA is not technically mandating that they build electric vehicles, because I think it even recognizes it has no statutory authority to do that, but instead is manipulating the standards, applying them on a fleet-wide average basis to achieve desired percentages. And this is the outcome that EPA is very overtly aiming toward, so that the result would be by 2032, 67% of new car, pickup, light truck sales in the United States would be electric vehicles by 2032. In doing that, EPA has essentially said, okay, the available control technology for reducing carbon dioxide is not something that goes on board the car, but it is an entirely different vehicle with an entirely different powertrain produced on entirely different production lines. It's completely outside the universe of internal combustion engine vehicles with tailpipes that emit the conventional pollutants. And so this entirely different technology over here is now what EPA considers the control technology to achieve these reductions. And by doing that, EPA is now effectively proposing to regulate electric vehicles, because since those are the control technologies that are needed to meet the standards, EPA has an interest in ensuring that those control technologies work. So now EPA is proposing to regulate the battery life of these vehicles. It will probably get into the business of regulating the infrastructure for the charging networks needed to run these vehicles to ensure that this alternative technology is actually workable and available. And that means now EPA is regulating under authorities to regulate vehicles that produce harmful air pollutants from their tailpipe. EPA is now going to be regulating vehicles that EPA says produce no emissions and have no tailpipes. And it is an example of stretching the bounds beyond anything under these statutory authorities, anything that Congress has ever directly considered and approved through the legislation. So it's an example of going well beyond these original authorities to attempt to address the unique problems created by carbon dioxide emissions. The same thing is happening with the proposed electric power rule, because as Mario described, EPA has to go outside the bounds of any technology that's currently available at these combined cycle baseload natural gas plants to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Carbon capture technology, carbon capture and storage technology has not yet been proven at scale with these big baseload plants, and the pipeline infrastructure to carry the carbon dioxide that will be captured doesn't exist. It will have to be permitted. It will have to be created. Similarly, the hydrogen is not being generated with renewable energy at the amounts and volumes that are needed, and the infrastructure to get the hydrogen to the plants is not there. And if you, as EPA is acknowledging, if you add the carbon capture and storage technology to these combined cycle plants, they will no longer be efficient combined two-cycle plants. The steam turbine will not be used to create electricity. It'll be used to power the carbon capture system. So the plants will be 28% less efficient and higher cost to operate. Similarly, on the vehicle side, the electric vehicles are going to be much more expensive and will not perform the same range of utility of performance as an internal combustion engine vehicle. And so what's going to happen is lower and middle class Americans are not going to be able to afford or not going to want to buy many of these electric vehicles because they don't serve the full range of their family's needs, and they may not be affordable right now unless the market is flooded with Chinese electric vehicles, BYD, which would be cheap, but I don't think that's what the Biden administration is envisioning would happen here. So the problem with that is huge negative effects for the quality of life for many, many, many millions of American families if they no longer are able to afford or want to buy new vehicles. Because the problem with that is that new vehicles are much safer than old vehicles. And if more and more American families are left driving older and older used vehicles because of this forced transformation in the industry, that's a terrible outcome for the nation. And similarly with electricity, if the costs go up, the amount of electricity generated is squeezed down, that will have enormously negative effects across the entire economy for all Americans. And I don't think Americans understand what's happening because these issues have not been surfaced and debated in Congress. These are issues, these are proposed policies that will have national implications, and the balance of impact, the cost for many people, the effect on quality of life is so transformational, so enormous, that this is a political judgment, a national political judgment in both of these areas, electricity generation and automobile emissions, that Congress really needs to take on. And so what we need is a new statutory structure, a new debate in Congress. Congress needs to directly take on these questions. Is this what we want to do for the nation? Do we want to force by regulation the industry to move to electric vehicles? What's the balance of considerations? How will that impact the average American family? Will they be able to afford them? Will it serve their needs? We depend so heavily on vehicles in this country. It's our freedom machine. It allows people to function in the economy. And similarly, affordable electricity is fundamental to every activity every American undertakes in the economy. So the balance of these considerations, these are massive political judgments. The American people need to see this debate. It needs to happen among their elected representatives in Congress, and I think that's the only right approach and result here. And I think that leads to another reason why I do believe the courts are likely to strike down these proposals if they're finalized as they currently look like they will be. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Mike, I just want to. So this is the
right one.
This
Yeah.
is the less provocative
Yeah,
title.
yeah, it's
you
still
went from the
provocative.
Maoist analogy to the
To a
Leninist
Stalinist
analogy.
one, yeah.
Because I saw the thing and I just want. There literally was a 5-year plan for electrification.
Yeah.
100 years ago in
Yeah.
the Soviet Union.
Yes, Lenin was a big fan of electrification of everything, which actually James C. Scott talks about in his book, Seeing Like a State, which is where my little epigram here comes from. I'm going to start with some psychologizing a little bit, and that's the Scott quote about the more intractable and resistant the real world faced by the planner, the greater the need for utopian plans to fill, as it were, the void that would otherwise invite despair. And I want to, that's a sort of tee up for, can we get the next slide? A sociological observation I think it's important to have at the outset, which is the distinction between, I think, the two camps of environmentalist activism in the US and globally, between techno-optimists, you can guess which one is a techno-optimist here in the photos, and the degrowth movement. So if you go to the next slide as well, the dreams of unlimited growth, right, Greta Thunberg, that's a degrowth mentality, and I think degrowth is the reigning paradigm in a lot of climate activist and climate concerned folks, and I think that's true both among scientists. I think Roger Pilkey has shown that there's some good research on this, and it's also true, I think, in a lot of the folks working in the agencies and in this administration, that they have a generally degrowth mentality to things. So the problem with that, of course, is degrowth is not really that politically popular. Can we go to the next slide? And so much of what you see from this administration is couched in techno-optimist terms. I think an example of this is the executive order that sets the goal of 50% electrification by 2030. This was from 2021. EPA's new proposed rules go significantly further than this. And one thing that's very interesting in looking at this executive order and in a lot of those early executive orders from the Biden administration is this phrase, whole of government effort, whole of government approach, right? This gets to something Stephen was talking about, which is that there's no law that says, EPA or Department of Transportation, you get to set what you think the right level of electrification of the vehicle fleet is. That doesn't exist. And so to get there, it's not just one rule that reverse engineers a preferred outcome. It's a constellation of mutually reinforcing, interlocking rules, many of which bake in aspects of other proposed rules. So the California rules, for instance, are baked into NHTSA's proposal as part of what NHTSA calls the baseline, so that, I think of that as kind of like a regulatory Horcrux from Harry Potter, right? You kill the one thing, but its soul survives, secreted somewhere else. So this whole of government effort, can we go to the next slide, I think is largely broken down into 3 prongs. You have the EPA tailpipe emissions, you've got NHTSA's fuel economy standards, and then you've got the California Air Resources Board, EV mandates, and greenhouse gas standards. I want to focus on what the little red box surrounds, the model year 2027 light-duty multi-pollutant standards. But I think, as was already pointed out, these build off of the framework the legal framework that's already been articulated in the 2023 standards, which were finalized about 2 years ago, and which are now being litigated in the DC Circuit. Those were argued this past September. And full disclosure, I'm a lawyer in all of those cases, basically. But these are my own views, not on behalf of any client here. I'm just sharing my insights from my experience with this. So that I think Stephen really put it nicely about the way these reverse engineer a preferred outcome of electrification. I don't think it's accurate to say that the initial rules didn't require electrification. There was no scenario EPA put forward in that rule where they envisioned any manufacturer going into the future without electrifying at least some of their fleet. I suppose it's always true that you can comply with rules by going out of business or stopping to sell cars in the U.S., but leaving that aside, beyond that, I don't think there is any way of complying with the first set of rules without electrifying. But regardless of whether that's true or not, the new rules certainly do. Could we go to the next slide? And you can see at the bottom there, the proposal pushes to a projected 67% of light-duty vehicles and 46% of medium-duty vehicles being battery electric by 2032. This comes from this sort of reverse engineering idea of, well, if you set average standards that can't be complied with by conventional vehicles, then you're going to have to incorporate an increasing percentage of electric vehicles, which are deemed to have a zero.
And just to interrupt, battery electric means not hybrid.
Yeah, so there's battery electric, and then there are two kinds of hybrids. There are there are three, but two main kinds. There's the plug-in kind, which is an EV that also has a motor in it, so it can work both ways. And then there's the more traditional, like the Prius, which uses regenerative braking and other things to recapture energy that's created by an internal combustion engine to increase efficiency. Could we go to the next slide? So there has been some talk, I'm sure many of you, if you've been following this, have seen of some kind of compromise. It's true that the autos came in on the side of EPA, at least to some extent in that first rule, but the autos, I think it's safe to say, were not very pleased with, if you look at their comments, they were not very pleased at all with this proposal. Initially, it was going to be announced in Detroit, and then with a few days' notice, once the autos got the pre-read version of the rule, they said, hell no, we're not doing this here, and they moved it to DC. So I do think that the administration is likely to scale down the ramp rate. You can see in that chart a modest change in the rate of change, but not a change in the ultimate outcome. Actually, the alternative 3 that is in the rule that is apparently where the EPA is going ends up marginally higher than the initial proposal. But it's, as I think you can see, it's a pretty small difference, and it still goes way beyond the proposed goal from 2021 of 50% electrification. Can we have the next slide, please? So, I think the reason for this kind of change is that there's a degrowth purpose to this, but degrowth is bad politics. A vignette that I have here, which I think goes to the there's no requirement point that we heard earlier. AFPM, which is the refiners, obviously they've got a strong interest in keeping liquid fuels alive. They put some ads out. And then Climate Power, which is allied with the White House, and actually I think one of the Podestas is on their board, kind of sent these demand letters saying that these needed to be pulled because they were false, misinformation. Not something the FCC has authority to regulate, by the way. There's a Supreme Court case called Susan B. Anthony List versus Dryhouse that started on almost exactly the same way that says that this is not a problem, even if it were false, which I don't think it is. And I think there's a Streisand effect to this as well, where by drawing attention, I hadn't even seen these ads, but I did see the Wall Street Journal article about Climate Power, so I think they actually drew more attention to the thing they were trying to get rid of than they wanted. So. In any event, I think that goes to show this political concern that mandates, EV mandates, ICE, internal combustion engine bans, those things are not popular politics, and I think it's because they're seen correctly in many ways as degrowth in the way they have a vision for the future for many of the same reasons Stephen already covered. Can we go to the next slide? Now, I do want to just give a few glimpses of areas where I think the rule is just wrong in the proposed rule, just things that aren't true. So to make it seem like it's a good thing for the economy, they say there's huge benefit, $450 billion to $890 billion. And to count this, they have to assume that consumers are so irrational that they do not know how to price fuel efficiency into their purchasing decisions at all. So-called energy efficiency gap. There probably is an energy efficiency gap, but the notion that that consumers give no weight to whether a car is efficient or not, it's not true. People care about that. And they also say that there aren't any performance trade-offs. In the last rule, they said that any increases in efficiency don't come, it's a free lunch, right? It doesn't come with any cost elsewhere. I mean, I think all you need to do is think about whether you like the auto stop start function in your vehicle. I've never met anyone who likes those, but that's an efficiency technology that changes the performance of your vehicle. So that alone, I think, is not true. Certainly, efficiency increases, I think, by their nature, are going to have impacts on acceleration and towing capacity, which a lot of people care about. Could we go to the next slide? Another aspect of it is the kind of apples-to-apples way in which the rule treats electric vehicles and conventional vehicles for compliance purposes. They say that EVs emit no emissions, but internal combustion vehicles do, and of course that's true, but that emission profile is just different, right? They emit upstream emissions at a greater level because they have to be plugged into the grid and all these sort of things. If you had a little generator in a trailer that you towed behind your car that was emitting, all kinds of pollutants and carbon dioxide, that wouldn't change that would be irrational to say that you can consider the vehicle and not that little trailer. And the only difference is that you have miles of transmission lines connecting it. It's just a more complex version of the same thing. Particulate matter, this is, I think, one of the things that made me most angry is the notion that you've got vehicles that today, right, as Stephen mentioned, there's the emissions from vehicles are much, much lower. Conventional emissions are much lower. And actually, a lot of the particulate matter that comes from vehicles is actually from tire wear and brake dust. The heavier the vehicle, it's basically a linear function. The heavier the vehicle, the more of that there's going to be. EVs are about 20% heavier on average compared to their counterparts using an internal combustion engine. And so they have more particulate matter, and EPA just blows past this. Can we go to the next slide? And then they also say that EVs, the projection of costs, I think, is just outrageous. Currently, EVs are a lot more expensive to make than they sell for. So using MSRP, with the what's on the Monroney sticker on the side of the car when you go to the lot, that is not the actual cost. Ford, for instance, loses, according to their own disclosures, $60,000 or so per electric vehicle that they sell. There's also, I think, problems with the battery cost projection that EPA has. And they also offshore a bunch of costs by saying tax credits and charging infrastructure stuff that's a cost in the Inflation Reduction Act and some other more recent statutes, that those aren't costs. And so they shouldn't be factored into this analysis, which makes very little sense to me. So those are my own projections that we did in our comments on the rule. But I think even on the low end, you can see, I think there's a pretty big delta between what EPA projects and what I think a more fair assessment is on costs. Could we go to the next slide? Now, if you force this transformation, even assuming that people want to buy them, which current trends are that people actually don't, EV sales are being overtaken by hybrids because hybrids function like a normal car when you need it to. I do think it's going to drive up vehicle costs quite dramatically. If Ford continues, and maybe it won't, but if Ford continues to have to spend $120,000 or so per electric vehicle that it makes, if you think about how cross subsidies work, the larger the amount of, you have to spread that cost, right? They are a business, they're going to make money. So they can afford that loss on the EVs when it's just a few percentage because they just have a marginal increase in the cost of every other car. But as that changes, as you get more EVs, the percentage that you're going to have to jack up the price of conventional vehicles goes up. You have to squeeze that profitable part of the business to fund the unprofitable part further. Our projections were that you'd go from about $36,000 for a new Ford today to $92,000 in today's dollars for a new Ford in 2032. Which brings me to the point that I think this is ultimately a degrowth policy, that it's not about a transition to electric vehicles at all. It's about shrinking the vehicle market as a whole. Take the bus, ride the Lime scooter, walk, stay home. And that's a future that I think a lot of folks have been very candid about, especially in California. California has said for a long time that their ultimate goal is to reduce vehicle miles traveled. Again, I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad policy goal to talk about, but you have to have things that actually will get political support. If you try to do things that don't, eventually you're going to run into some serious backlash. And if we can go to the next slide. Yeah, I think I won't get into this because Stephen covered it, but I think there are many reasons why this attempt is unlikely to succeed given recent developments in the law, and particularly this averaging thing that the EPA does, which is exactly what NHTSA does for corporate average fuel economy standards. The CAFE program, and that has that explicitly in the statute, and EPA doesn't. Instead, they said, back in the 80s, they said, Congress didn't specifically contemplate it, and it's coming from statutory silence. Well, if you've been following the Loper-Bright case, you know that the weak version of that case, the weak version of what the Supreme Court's considering, not even getting rid of Chevron entirely, but the weak version of it is no Chevron when there's statutory silence. So that, at the very least, seems to be in a tenuous position. And even the D.C. Circuit in the 80s, which was not a particularly conservative place, was skeptical. Back then, the NRDC was the one arguing that averaging was a problem. Was skeptical about this in a case called NRDC versus Thomas. Can we go to the next slide?
So we probably need to.
Okay, yeah, this is the last slide. Yeah, do this or fry the planet. I just think that's like the classic Washington syllogism of, we need to do something, this is something, therefore we need to do it. And I think that is profoundly foolish. The cost per ton, even on EPA's own projections, is $370. That is not a good deal. Basically anything else is a more cost-effective way of reducing emissions. And if you take our cost estimates, and I think they're at least plausible, certainly the EPA's ones are not, cost goes up an order of magnitude, up to $4,700, which is insane. I think we need to do things to reduce carbon emissions and to improve efficiency, but we should do things that actually work. And we should do things that actually will be sustainable and that people will accept. And so with that, I will wrap up, and thank you.
So thank you. I will. One of the things that makes soccer, in the minds of most Green Bay Packer fans, one of the things that makes soccer a truly silly, one of the many things that makes soccer a truly silly sport, is the ability of the ref to just add like mystery number of minutes to the end of the game at the end of the game. I'm going to transport that to today's conference and add at least 10 minutes, and I feel justified in doing that, among other things, because I'm not just the moderator, but the organizer of the whole conference. I also do not see the moderator of the next panel in evidence before the court, and so therefore we are in free time, at least 10 minutes, or until the moderator shows up. So Susan, take all the time you need.
Okay, call me foolish, Michael. It's funny. Thank you for letting me go last, because I'm the non-lawyer on the panel. For those that don't know me, I've been working on climate and energy issues now for 24 years. So that was kind of extraordinary to me to listen to you both, and I say this, respectfully, but it was incredibly tortured to listen to every way we want to continue a system that allows polluters to pollute for free while we all pay for it. I disagreed with so many things. I don't know where to start, but let me walk you through. So I met Joanne in an era in Florida, and I even mentioned it, where in 2005, Jeb Bush, under the theory of being alarmed that we were 48% reliant on gas, put out two policies. One was early cost recovery, talk about the most obvious way to socialize risk and privatize profits by allowing the utilities to charge in advance for new nuclear power. And in our state, none of it got built. So it was a not free market, total disaster. The other thing that came out at that time were proposals to build as many as 7 coal-fired power plants in the state of Florida. And that's where Joanne and I crossed paths. And we were at the Florida Public Service Commission, and both of us are proud that at that moment, and it was a plant, the Taylor Energy Center, with Jacksonville Utility and Muni, the City of Tallahassee and Muni, the Florida Municipal Power Agency, and believe it or not, Disney World. Reedy Creek wanted I think it was a 9% position in that coal plant. And we got the Florida Public Service Commission for the very first time to really go on the record to say that if you're going to build a power plant that's going to be around for 60 years, you really need to factor in a price of carbon. So what my new friends here, Stephen and Michael, I believe were saying is that it's okay that we allow polluters, or what I would say subsidize, the polluting industries to pollute for free while we all paid for it. We talked a lot about it yesterday, about the cost of inaction. The cost of inaction is always greater than the cost of action. We are feeling the heat. We are paying the price right now. I was walking in to the meeting her today talking about, Hurricane Ian. My own sister and her husband's home was completely destroyed, and I think 157 people died. So what's the cost of that? So in this era where we started to look about the cost of carbon, it was someone that I've come to admire just reading about him was C. Boyden Gray. And C. Boyden Gray did something really amazing, which is he applied a market-based mechanism to dealing with the acid rain program. And it was sort of under budget, moved faster. I mean, by every account, that was a very big success for using a market-based mechanism. So it's sort of frustrating to me to listen to, sort of the conservative side. It was the same conversation, at least with Ken Lastman from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, where I keep hearing people say market-based mechanisms, and I'm not hearing market-based mechanisms. What is it costing us to continue to emit these fossil fuels, whether it's from internal combustion engines or from power plants? And so even if you are putting these constraints, I spent some time really looking at carbon capture and storage, and I'm talking about where you inject it under. I am an environmentalist. I'm only here because of my concern about our warming planet. There are some places you can do that. Is it all completely figured out? Absolutely not. Did the EPA just give Tampa Electric, which is near the area where I am, they have a demonstration coal gasification plant, and during that period of time where I myself was fighting 7 proposals to build coal-fired power plants, I was looking at coal gasification, because at least then you take the mercury out, right? Like what's even the lesser of the evil conversation? Again, this is quite a long time ago. They've just gotten $80 million, and they do think that right under that Polk station, which was a DOE pilot, it's a small plant, that they can inject it. I mean, let them try. But what they're forcing is a real, true analysis of the cost. What the policies need to do is say, if it's cheaper to build new renewables and battery storage, then let's do that and shut down that old coal plant because maybe it's, not economically viable. Like, let's do that. I mean, the conversation about electric vehicles being expensive. So, I mean, I've been driving electric vehicles since 2018. One of the organizations that I worked with ran a program called Drumming on Sunshine to get people behind the wheel of electric vehicles. COVID kind of shut that down because people don't really want to get in a car with a stranger during that period of time. But nonetheless, they're just cheaper. And it's funny. I mean, you charge, and filling up your car with charge is a third of what gas would be. And guess what? Because there's so many fewer moving parts, you don't care if you have mileage. If you're buying an internal combustion engine, what's the first thing you look at? Well, what's the mileage? It's like not the same, and I mean, electric vehicles are amazing. So much more fun to drive. I don't even like to drive. So to just pull out these tortured arguments, which is what again, I don't mean to, make light of it, but that you all are making that are, just not even really what the discussion about the problem is here. It's not like, kind of a, gimme point. So we took the big greens in 2009 with the Waxman-Markey bill, which did pass the House. They modeled it because of the success of C. Boyden Gray's acid rain program. And guess what? Not a single Republican voted for it. It wasn't because they're trying to solve a problem. And that's 2008-9 era. Look where we're at now. Nobody wants to solve a problem. We just want to pitch it into some kind of political battle, which is ridiculous because people are suffering and they cannot afford their high electric bills. And guess what? I told the story yesterday. The Great Bay distributor, Anheuser-Busch distributor in my area, put up 1.5 megawatts on their cold storage facility. And in 5.15 years, that savings paid for the improvement. This is 7 years ago. Solar was way more expensive. So I want every family, so their energy is affordable, to have that opportunity. So we have to finance the solar, because a utility, they build a gas plant, stick it on your bill, and you're paying for it. And guess what? Every single utility in Florida over the last 3 years, gas prices have gone through the roof, and power bills have gone through the roof. Florida Power and Light bought Gulf Power. It's a small utility in the Panhandle. They told them their bills would go down because it was a bigger rate base. And they bought that plant because a Southern company was hemorrhaging money from Plant Vogtle, which is why that Southern company owned Gulf Power, which is a side story, but everyone wanted to talk about how efficiently cheap nuclear power is, and it's not. So anyway, they said your bills go down. Their bills went up 68%. Tampa Electric, 64%. Florida Power and Light, 51%. And Duke Energy, 31%. Oh, and like Friday before last, they just announced another rate increase. So this is where we're at. So please, it feels a little disingenuous when you're telling me you're worrying about people's electric bill. I'm worrying about people's electric bill. And that's why we're going to take advantage of the incentives that come down, and we're going to finance. There's a program called Solar for All. Hopefully, Florida gets some funding for that, 15,000 low-income homes. This is how we're going to help people. We're going to ride around with insulation trucks. It's cheap. Florida sends $64.5 billion a year out of state to bring in fossil fuel from somewhere else. How smart is that? How does that help our local economy? It does not. So I'm going to end with this. F. Scott Fitzgerald says the sign of a first-rate intelligence is when you can hold two completely opposing ideas in your mind at one time and still function. So on one hand, I can believe that everything is sort of utterly hopeless, and on the other hand, I'm entirely optimistic. But we need to be smart about this. You know, right in the Trump administration, and I know it was the Highway Safety Agency and not the area that you were involved in, Department of Transportation, you were. So he tried to roll back, Donald Trump did roll back, actually, it just didn't take effect, the safe vehicle rules for the 21 to 2026. And in that report, and I remember falling off my chair when I read it first, and I went back to it to prep for this, it was going to bring our parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere to 789.89. That is in their report. Anyone who live in that inhospitable planet, right? We're at like, you know, to whatever we're at, 30 now or something. 700, I'd never even read a number like that, and I've been working on this for 24 years. So if you think that policy is going to help anybody, let alone people who are the most vulnerable, I mean, that is the most tortured, sort of conversation to try to continue a system where polluters are polluting for free and we're all paying for it. And that's where we're at now. So maybe everything about the rule isn't perfect, but we need to get there one way or another.
But we thank you for that. So in the 7 minute, I'm calling 7 minutes of mystery time so that Flavio Carrillo can start with the International Finance panel at 10:45. But I do want the record to show that Susan said that she disagreed with Michael and Steve, but not with me. And the reason is that Susan agrees with me, or I thought at least 2 weeks ago.
Can I have a 2-sentence response?
Yeah.
I just wanted to talk about the EV rules. I am for cap and trade or carbon tax. I just didn't see that within the scope of this. So I'm happy to talk about those policy things. I just think this isn't a good one.
And that's something that we teach in law school a lot, which is that we separate the normative policy question from the purely legal one. And here it's really my focus is, are these rules survivable? They are going to be challenged, 100% guaranteed to be challenged in the DC Circuit. And what Steve and Michael are talking about, and what Joanne and I are talking about, may not be the conversation on this, but in the land of, but it will be the conversation before the D.C. Circuit.
No, I understand, and
And-
as a non-lawyer, I was generalizing more, for sure. and I
100%.
stated that.
But going back to, the record did show that Susan did not say she disagreed with me, and I think that this is because
time.
you and I talked about this, that you did not think that you agreed with me that the carbon capture, storage, and green hydrogen are not adequately demonstrated.
Well, I don't, you're being technical, and I don't want to be, caught in kind of lawyer land there, but it's not, they are not being widely used. But I was just telling early at our table, Miami-Dade County has a pilot that the Department of Environmental Protection is funding to use a hydrogen bromine chemistry to treat biosolids, and at a wastewater treatment plant, right now they truck biosolids up to the Indian River Lagoon and land apply it. Like, that's not good. So the hydrogen word is every other word now, but there's different kinds of hydrogen, so I can't blanketly say it doesn't work. I don't think we know that, but we do need to figure out what does work. That's all. All
Okay.
hands on deck, but that's different than arguing in the court.
Okay, thank you. So I'll pull moderator's prerogative to ask one question about the vehicle rule and I would ask both Joanne and maybe Michael, unless Steve has a strong opinion about this too. If you noticed, Mike, so the EPA rule, EPA has multiple rules for different light duty. It has different rules for light duty vehicles than for heavy duty vehicles, and the reason is that the legal standards for those two sets of emission standards are different under Title II of the Clean Air Act. And while Section 202C specifies it gives a little bit more on how EPA can define a class of vehicles. The phrase, emissions standards for any class of vehicle that's in 202A can just has to be given its natural meaning of what could Congress have meant by class of vehicle. And so my question is that didn't make any sense to me, and I'm not an expert in Title II of the Clean Air Act, but it didn't make any sense to me when I saw this. I was like, wait a second, if EPA is defining a class of vehicle to include both electric vehicles that have zero emissions and combustion engine vehicles, then why can't it just define a class of vehicles as to include golf carts and then do an average of the emissions from golf carts and Mustangs for the purposes of determining what an emissions rate should be in the regulation of emissions from Mustangs? And that just seems to me like you could go into court and say, EPA's inclusion of electric vehicles in this, it might as well include bicycles in the definition of a class of vehicle if it's going to use this approach, and that is contrary to the natural meaning of class of vehicle. Is that foreclosed by court precedents already? You said that they could include.
They could include golf carts?
That they could include electric vehicles. Well, the golf carts are electric vehicles, right? Because they go off the footprint.
So yeah,
right?
the Clean Air Act defines motor vehicles as any self-propelled vehicle designed for transporting persons or property on a street or highway.
Sure, but class of
without
vehicle.
any mention of internal combustion engines. So in terms of dividing classifications, it can divide vehicles within that definition, how it sees fit, as long as it's reasonable. And it's similar to the classifications in the stationary source rules. So the stationary source rule, EPA gets to define categories and subcategories based on various factors. And they can do that based on fuel, but they could also do that based on the size of the plant, or the function. Like, is it a base load, or is it a peaker, or is it?
So it's your position that EPA could establish standards for a category of power plants that includes both baseload natural gas plants and nuclear plants for the purpose of regulating emissions for natural gas plants? That's what it's doing in the vehicle rule.
So let me just point to another part of the statute that says that. Wait a minute, I got to find it. So what the 202A1 says, whether such vehicles and engines are designed as complete, this is a, let me back up. A standard of the standards for vehicles can apply whether such vehicles and engines are designed as complete systems or incorporate devices to prevent pollution control. So a complete system could be a different kind of vehicle. So,
Yeah. Okay, we have to wrap up, but I just want
I
to say.
have a quick response
Yeah,
on it.
yeah.
So the relevant language you're talking about is the emission of a pollutant, right? So you can put in controls. So this is an open question in answer to whether the courts have actually, it's being litigated in the DC Circuit right now. And one of the arguments we made was that that class of means the class that emits that pollutant, right? And so because electric vehicles do not emit that pollutant, they can't be put in that class. And the question is, like, what does that mean? Sometimes you can talk about, like, an unruly class. Well, not everyone in the class is unruly, and you can have that set, and the class can still be unruly. On the other hand, if you said, like, a class of immunosuppressant drugs, it would be very strange to find something that doesn't have an immunosuppressant effect in that class. So it's a grammatical, textual question, and our argument is that both because of the major question sort of part of it and also because of the text, that you can't do that, and certainly you can't use averaging. If you get rid of averaging, which the statute doesn't have, then this is easy, right? But if you're in averaging land, this becomes a key question, and I think it just comes down to how you interpret the word class.
And can I just say about averaging? Averaging has been around for 40 years. It's not new to CO2, and it wasn't challenged. The industry likes it. They want it.
Oh yeah,
So-
that's why the autos intervened on behalf of
Yeah.
EPA, because they love
Yeah,
it.
yeah. I think that there's a simple reason why the autos, their planning cycle is longer than the cycle of the emission of the vehicle years, the model years. But I think as much as I'd love to continue talking about this, I'm under an obligation to the moderator of the next panel to begin when I told him it would begin, the third time that I changed the start time. So Flavio, come up. International Finance Panel.
Okay.
I see some of you back in the back there. Come on up. Thank you very much. Thank you.